George Winslow Whittington. April 22, 1900 to January 22, 1970. A calm and courageous African-American brakeman in North Carolina, George Winslow Whittington was the son of Benjamin Franklin Whittington, 1867 to 1930, and Maggie Carson Whittington, 1870 to 1934. He was born in McDowell County in the Pleasant Gardens community between Marion and Old Fort, North Carolina. A respected resident of Black Mountain for 42 years, Whittington devoted his life to railroading, his tenure spanning the transition from steam-powered engines to diesel. The 1910 census reports Ben Whittington working as a laborer on the railroad. His oldest son, William, 1894 to 1963, was off fighting a war, and his son, Herman, 1896 to 1910, had died young. So 9-year-old Winslow was the oldest male left in a home of 7 siblings when the railroad hired him as a water boy. He was unable to continue his education. Winslow's 1918 World War I draft registration shows him living in Ridgecrest as a section laborer for Southern Railroad Company. The 1920 census finds Benjamin Whittington working as a section hand for the railroad, with young Winslow working there as an extra force at age 19. By 1940, the Asheville City Directory places Winslow in the position of brakeman for Southern Railway System. In that perilous role, gentle-tempered Winslow walked atop moving boxcars to manually set brakes as the steam locomotive sped down winding mountains and through dark tunnels. The 7 tunnels in the stretch of track from Old Fort to Ridgecrest were particularly hazardous. Historically, the brakeman's job was among the most dangerous of the train's crew. Injuries, fatalities, and loss of limbs from falling off speeding trains, being crushed beneath boxcars, or crashing into overhead bridges and trackside structures were common. In the mid to late 1950s, Winslow broke ribs when he fell from a moving boxcar. He eventually returned to work full steam ahead, retiring circa 1963. The merits of the job were good wages and train passes given out to railroad employees and family members with extended privileges on other rail carriers. Consequently, Winslow's wife, Minnie Stepp Whittington, and their 9 children, Lila, David, Willie, Leona, Sharon, Catherine, George, Leslie, and Keith, born between 1935 and 1958, enjoyed travel to populous cities like Tuskegee, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. A steady railroad paycheck and stable values enabled Winslow, a consummate provider, to produce 7 college graduates, setting an undefeated record for the Cragmont community. One tool of Winslow's trade was the railroad lantern, used to communicate signals at night between trains and stations. A vintage short globe lantern presented by Southern Railway Company provides a tangible connection to George Winslow Whittington, an early railroader whose light shone brightly throughout his family, church, and valley.
I'm going back to that Swananoa Tunnel. That's my home, baby.
Welcome to the Rural Heritage Museum and the current exhibition, How the West Was Won, Trains and the Transformation of Western North Carolina. We're standing in front of the Swannanoa Tunnel. The tunnel was completed in 1879, and a year later, the first train chugged into Asheville. And at that time, the world changed in Western North Carolina. The railroad brought in timber barons, brought in mining executives, it brought in tourists to the region. Interstate 40 passes over the top of the Swannanoa Tunnel today. People go by here with no idea of the importance of this railroad, this tunnel, in the development of Western North Carolina. When they completed this tunnel on March 11th in 1879, the following message was sent to Governor Zebulon Baird Vance in Raleigh. Daylight entered Buncombe County today through the Swannanoa Tunnel. Grade and centers met exactly. Now, when you think about the fact that they had dug this tunnel from the east and the west simultaneously and met in the middle exactly, it was a feat unheard of in its day. And it was done with the crudest of construction techniques, with the use of convict laborers, and there was a great celebration when this tunnel was completed. But within hours after it was completed, this tunnel collapsed and 23 convict laborers died in the process. As we see the train going down the mountain through Swannanoa Tunnel, it's heading down the nearly 9 miles of loops to go 3.1 miles as the crow flies down the Old Fort grade. The Old Fort loops have been made famous by the novel by John Ely called The Road, and he in that novel accurately describes the 1,500 people who worked on the construction of these loops and the difficulties they experienced. The fact that 125 lives were lost in the construction of this, and the construction of the tunnel behind me, the Swannanoa Tunnel, not only cost the lives of 23 of the convict laborers who, when it collapsed in 1879, but we estimate there were another 100 convict laborers who died in the construction of just these 9 miles of loops. We're standing by the Andrews Geyser at the foot of the Old Fort Mountain loops. Actually, we're standing just inside the loops themselves, and we're going to see a train as it loops around us. Built between 1877 and 1879. It was a major engineering feat for its day, and there, just across the tracks on the inside the loop here is the Round Knob Hotel, one of the first hotels to try to capture the tourist business coming to the mountains. But Andrews Geyser was named after Alexander Boyd Andrews, one of the vice presidents of Southern Railway. One of the 3 construction techniques that were used to get up the Blue Ridge Escarpment was to build these loops. Again, 9 miles of loops to go 3.1 miles as the crow flies, and 2,770 degrees of curvature on these tracks going up the mountain. That's the equivalent of over 8 circles you've completed between the bottom of the grade and the top of the grade in the Swannanoa Tunnel. There are no foothills here, so they needed to get up and over the mountains with as efficient and the safest way possible. We're standing at the top of Saluda Grade, the steepest standard gauge mainline grade in the United States. It ran from 1878 continuously through December of 2001. The plan had been to build 13 miles of loops up the mountains between Asheville and Spartanburg, but they ran short of money, and so they came straight up and over. There were basically 3 techniques used coming into the mountains. This was one. The first crest of these mountains was on Saluda Grade in 1878. The second time that these mountains were crested was following the second techniques, the loops used on Old Fort Mountain. And the third technique building railroads into these mountains was to follow the rivers along the French Broad line, where they would carve a shelf along the river and simply lay the tracks along those lines. They did this not only on the French Broad line, they did it on the Murphy line, following the Tuckasegee River and the Nantahala River, again carving a shelf into the mountains. Along with loops and along with the straight up and over approach to coming into the mountains, as they did on Saluda Grade, we have the easiest way through the mountains was to simply carve a shelf along the river. We're standing in Marshall, right alongside the river, where they simply carved tracks alongside the French Broad River, laid them in, and every time that the river makes a turn, these tracks make a turn. The result is a fairly slow train ride, and hence the name, as you'll discover in the exhibit. There was a passenger train called the Carolina Special, which local people called the Carolina Creeper. 25 miles an hour was the maximum speed limit on this line. Once the railroad arrived in Asheville, it began promotion almost immediately of tourism to the mountains of western North Carolina. They used Christian Reed's book, The Land of the Sky, a novel, and appropriated the title to promote tourism in the region. And so even today, western North Carolina is referred to by what Southern Railway called the Land of the Sky. And in Asheville itself, the number of boarding houses that went up to attract middle-class travelers to the mountains just burgeoned as well. By the turn of the 20th century, there were over 100 boarding houses, similar to the old Kentucky home run by Thomas Wolfe's mother, Julia Wolfe. And if you read the novel, Look Homeward Angel, you can experience what life was like circa 1916 in one of these boarding houses, where people from Charleston, the Piedmont of North Carolina and South Carolina, came to these mountains to experience cool mountain breezes in the hot summer months. Once the mainline railroads arrived in western North Carolina in the 1880s and 1890s, they were aware of the virgin timber stands, and they began buying up massive tracts, along with land for mining purposes as well. But what they needed were locomotives that could be used on the mountainsides to bring down the large timber. And what they had were Climax locomotives, Heislers, Shays, and this is an example from the Cradle of Forestry in western North Carolina, just off the Blue Ridge Parkway, which you might want to visit as well. But in order to get to the timber and in order to get to the mines, they needed locomotives that could make tight turns, light rail, narrow gauge, and unlike standard gauge, this is 3-foot gauge track. And locomotives that basically were light and could be laid down, as many of these tracks were, right over logs without ties. So the Climax locomotives was used extensively in the Great Smoky Mountains to literally take the forest down. And they denuded mountainsides with tracks such as this, and when they were through, believe it or not, they could simply take up the tracks behind them, lay them down in the next cove, and move this engine over to the next area to be cut. But billions of board feet of timber moved out of these mountains because of these engines, which were able to be used in the back country, which today, if you went into, you would not believe that they could get in there. But they did, and they denuded the mountains in the process. One of the things we'd like you to learn about today is railroad slanguage. That's what we call terms used in railroading. And for example, we're in a caboose, which was on a Southern Railway train at one time, and they called these crummies. One of the reasons may be something about the conditions of these cabs, which they were also known as, but we want you to know what a caboose is, because today you will not see cabooses on trains anymore, because the crew members, the conductor, the flagman, the brakeman, who used to ride here and monitor the train as it was moving, has been replaced by trackside devices that monitor that same movement and radio their findings to the engineer. But this is where the crews used to operate from, and again, this is a very clean caboose compared to the way they looked in the days they were operational. We hope you enjoy your visit today at the Rural Heritage Museum and learn a great deal about how railroads impacted the mountains of western North Carolina. So let's get started. All aboard!
I'm going back to that Swananoa Tunnel. That's my home, baby. That's my home. Asheville Junction, Swananoa Tunnel, all caved in, baby, all caved in. Last December, I remember the wind blow cold, baby. The wind blow cold. When you hear my watchdog howling, somebody round, baby. Somebody round. When you hear that the hoot owl squalling, somebody died, baby. Somebody died.